Hi Year 7s and welcome back to Maths. Today we are doing multiplying decimals. Okay, so when you're multiplying decimals, it's a bit weird, but we actually ignore the decimals to begin with and do the multiplication as we would with just whole numbers. So when you're multiplying decimals, ignore the decimals first. We'll deal with them later. Multiply the numbers like normal, and then we will place the decimal back into the answer. So you need to, at the end, figure out how many decimal places were in the question to begin with, and then put those into your answer. And I'll show you how to do that. Okay, let's start with the first example. 12.31 times 7. Okay, so even though I've written 12.31, I'm going to ignore the decimal and just do it as if I was doing 1,231 times 7. So 7 times 1 is 7, 7 times 3 is 21, 7 times 2 is 14, plus 2 is 16, and 7 plus 1 is 8. All right, now I've got my answer. I've got 8,617, but I need to now do the final step, which is placing the decimal back into the answer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the two numbers I started off with and see how many decimal places are in those two original numbers. So I've got 2 decimal places here and none here because I've got a whole number with the 7. So I'm going to, remember that with whole numbers there's always an imaginary decimal place at the end of the number. I'm going to place in 2 decimal places. I'm going to move the decimal point 2 decimal places. And now I've got 86.17. All right, nice and easy. Let's do the next one. 5.31 times 1.2. Okay, so again, even though I've written the decimals in, I'm going to ignore them at the start and multiply my numbers like I would normally, like 531 times 12. All right, so 2 times 1 is 2, 2 times 3 is 6, 2 times 5 is 10. 1 times 1 is 1, 1 times 3 is 3, 1 times 5 is 5. Any empty spaces, there's a gap here, I can put a 0 in there, and then add these up. 2 plus 0 is 2, 6 plus 1 is 7, 0 plus 3 is 3, 5 plus 1 is 6. Okay, the final step is, again, I need to place the decimal back into my answer. So to do that, I need to have a look at how many decimal places are in my original question. So I've got 2 decimal places here and 1 there. So I need to move my decimal point 3 decimal places to the left. And when you're doing this, it's always to the left because 6,372 is a lot bigger than what the number was meant to be. So 6.372 is the final answer. All right. When you're multiplying decimals by multiples of 10, it's pretty similar, except so we're going to ignore the decimals, multiply the numbers like normal, and then we're going to place the number back in, place the decimal back into our answer by counting up how many decimal places were in the question. But we're also going to take into account the number of zeros that we have in our multiple of 10. So let's look at a few examples. Here I have 83.5 times 10,000. I'm actually going to ignore these zeros for now and just focus on the 1. So I'm going to multiply it by 1. And again, when you're multiplying with decimals, you can ignore the decimal to begin with. So 1 times 5, 1 times 3, and 1 times 8. And then you factor in the decimal point, so there's 1 decimal place there, so I'm going to move my decimal point 1 position to give me an answer of 83.5. However, now I need to take into account the number of zeros. So I originally had 4 zeros. So what I now have to do is I have to move my decimal point 4 places to the right. And I'm moving it to the right because I'm multiplying by 10,000. And remember, multiply to the right divide to the left. Okay. So that means my final answer is actually 835,000. Okay. The way that I actually like to set this up though is I'm quite forgetful. So I would, instead of writing 1 times 1, I actually like to write the zeros there just to remind myself that I have to deal with them. Okay, so this is method 2. It's just slightly different. And it's up to you whether or not you want to use method 2 or method 1. So method 1 is how the textbook does it. Method 2, I like to bring the zeros down so I don't forget about them. And then do 1 times 5, 1 times 3, 1 times 8. And then, once I've done that, I can then be like, okay, there's 1 decimal place I have to take into account there. And then move that to the left to give me a final answer of 835,000, which is the same answer. Okay. Let me just do one more example on this page where I have more space. Hang on, what was the... Okay. 0.032 times 600. So I'm going to do it using method 1 and then method 2. And again, you can choose which one makes more sense to you. Okay, so when you're doing any multiplication with decimals, you can ignore the decimals to begin with. And when you're doing multiplication with powers of 10 or multiples of 10, like we have here, I've got 600, we can ignore the 2 zeros and just focus on the 6 to begin with. Times 6. So 6 times 2 is 12, 6 times 3 is 18, plus 1 is 19. Then you got to take into account your decimal places. So I've got 1, 2, 3 decimal places here. So I'm going to take that into account by moving my decimal point. Oh. So there's my decimal point. I'm going to move it 1, 2, 3 places. Okay. But now we have to take into account the final 2 zeros. And to do that, we're multiplying by essentially, because we're multiplying, we have to move it to the right. So I'm going to then move my decimal point 2 positions to the right. So it's actually going to end up as 19.2. Okay, so just to recap, we did the multiplication, we ignored the zeros first behind the 6. We did the multiplication, we factored in the fact that there's 3 decimal places here. So I moved my decimal place 3 positions. And then I had to remember that there were actually 2 zeros after the 6, so I had to take those 2 into account by moving the decimal point 2 to the right to give me a final answer of 19.2. Okay, if you wanted to set it out the way that I did it, the second method, you would, that's method 1, but then you would add those 2 zeros in so you don't forget about them. Bring those 2 zeros down, do the multiplication, and then take into account the decimal place. So there's 1, 2, 3 decimal places there. So I'd go 1, 2, 3 to give me a final answer of 19.2. All right, you are now ready to do your exercises for 6E. Thank you.